If your idea of graphic design starts with a mouse click, you're about to step into a world where one slip of an X-Acto blade could set you back hours, and the smell of hot wax and rubber cement was just another Monday. In the 1970s, being a graphic designer meant building every headline by hand and gambling that your patience would outlast the deadline. Mistakes were not simply deleted, they cost real money and sometimes your reputation. Why did so many creative careers depend on perfectly cut rubylith masks and on phone calls to typesetters you had never met? The real story begins at the drafting table, hands stained with ink, and ends with a twist that changed design forever. A designer's day in the 1970s started with the familiar weight of an X-Acto knife in hand. The blade, razor sharp at first, would dull within an hour or two of careful rubylith cutting, forcing a practiced pause for a quick swap, always a fresh blade and always a wary eye on the tip. Fingers bore the nicks and calluses of hundreds of these changes, a silent tally of hours spent hunched over the cutting mat. Waxers sat humming on the edge of the drafting table, their metal rollers heated to about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of melting wax mixed with rubber cement and marker ink, settling into every corner of the studio. A careless touch could leave a burn, but the real danger was letting the wax run too cold. Then type galleys would peel up and layouts would shift when you least expected it. Getting the flow rate just right took a steady hand and a feel for the rhythm of the machine, feeding strips of type through with one hand and guiding them onto the board with the other. Transfer type sheets, Letraset and chart pack, waited in stacks nearby. Picking out a headline letter by letter, you would line up the sheet, press down with a burnisher and rub, feeling for the moment when the adhesive finally let go. Too much pressure and the paper tore, too little and the letter refused to transfer, leaving a ghostly outline behind. Rapidograph pens, those stubborn technical workhorses, sat in a cup of thinner, waiting for their next turn. They clogged without warning, demanding a ritual of cleaning as precise as any drawing. Every tool had its own ritual and its own sound, a blade sliding across acetate, the soft hiss of wax, the faint pop as a transfer letter released. Even the eraser had a signature move. Rub too hard and you would tear the board, too soft and the mistake stayed. For designers then, mastery meant knowing each tool's quirks and limits by heart. The toolkit was not just equipment, it was an extension of the artist's own hands. Specimen books lined the shelves, thick with pages of typefaces, each one a potential headline or body copy, but only if you could picture how it would look on the board. There was no scrolling through menus or clicking to test a font. Instead, you spent real time flipping pages, holding a ruler up to the samples, squinting to imagine the final effect. Once you landed on the right face and size, it was time to mark up the copy for the typesetter. Every instruction written by hand, every measurement checked twice. Then came the waiting. Days would pass before the typeset galleys arrived. Long strips of paper with your chosen words. If the wrong font or size came back, the whole process started over, and the bill grew with every mistake. Kerning by hand was a test of patience and vision. You would cut the galley apart, letter by letter if needed, nudging each piece closer or farther apart with tweezers, trusting only your eye to judge the spacing. There were no guides but your own sense of balance. Headlines often called for hand-lettered work, especially when a client wanted something unique, and one slip of the pen meant starting again. The tiniest typo could cost hours and real money. Paste-up artists remember the dread of discovering a misspelled word after everything was waxed down. One designer recalled spending a night redoing an entire magazine spread because a single letter was missing from a headline. The typesetter invoice did not care whose fault it was. Building a mechanical meant more than just arranging type. Every element was fixed to an illustration board, layered with acetate overlays for images or spot colors. Registration marks were drawn by hand at each corner, tiny crosshairs that printers depended on for perfect alignment. For every color in the design, a separate rubylith mask had to be cut and peeled, often with the same X-Acto knife you had used for hours already. Each mask became its own layer, stacked with absolute precision. Misregistration, a shift of even a millimeter could ruin an entire press run and send everyone back to the start. The process was unforgiving, but when everything lined up, there was a satisfaction you could feel in your bones. In that world, type was something you touched, assembled, and lived with every day. A finished mechanical wasn't the end of the job. It was only the beginning of a new round of collaboration. Once the boards were assembled, someone had to deliver them to the printer, usually by hand or courier, because these were fragile, one-of-a-kind objects. There was no digital backup, no way to send files across town. You carried the boards flat, cradled like treasure, knowing that a single jolt could ruin days of work. Printers and typesetters were not just service providers, they were partners, sometimes mentors. A master typesetter might earn $18,000 to $23,000 a year in the late 1970s, a solid middle-class wage, and their reputation was built on the ability to interpret a designer's instructions down to the last pica. Art directors, at the top of the ladder, could make $35,000 to $48,000, responsible for managing these complex relationships and keeping projects on track. Entry-level paste-up artists started around $10,000, while experienced designers with specialized skills like color separation could command $50 an hour as freelancers, though actual take-home was much less after covering all their own expenses. On the press floor, the ritual of the press check was a proving ground. Designers would stand beside printers, sometimes all night, watching the first sheets come off the press. The smell of ink was thick in the air, and everyone's eyes were on the registration marks, those tiny crosshairs drawn by hand back in the studio. A seasoned printer might offer a technical tip about adjusting the targets for better alignment, a gesture of respect and camaraderie. Approval meant signing off on the sheet, knowing that any mistake caught too late would cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars to fix. This web of collaboration was built on trust and mutual dependence. Every person in the chain had something real at stake: time, reputation, and money. The economics of the job demanded precision, not just for pride, because every revision, every reprint had a price. In that world, your livelihood depended on getting it right the first time. A paste-up artist from the era can still trace the scars on her fingers, tiny white lines from years of X-Acto slips, the result of rushing to meet a deadline or simply working tired. She remembers the ache in her wrists after long days spent slicing rubylith, the dull throb that crept up her arm each night. The wax machine left its own reminders, a faint burn on the inside of her thumb from a careless brush against the roller, a sting that lingered long after the layout was done. There was no talk of ergonomic chairs or proper ventilation. The air in the studio hung heavy with fumes from rubber cement and thinner, enough to leave you lightheaded by the afternoon. Most designers just opened a window, if there was one, and carried on. Repetitive strain was part of the job. Some developed tendinitis or carpal tunnel, but few considered stopping. The work was physical, relentless, and the tools did not forgive mistakes. A dropped rapidograph could splatter ink across a nearly finished board, forcing hours of repair. When a tool failed or a hand slipped, you paid for it in time, money, and sometimes blood. Then, in 1984, a new kind of tool arrived, the Macintosh. By 1985, Aldus PageMaker promised layouts in hours, not days. Within 5 years, studios that once buzzed with the sounds of cutting and waxing were clearing out drafting tables and tossing rubylith in the trash. Some designers adapted, learning to click and drag instead of cut and paste. Others, after decades of mastering the old ways, found themselves left behind. The profession split overnight. For every artist who embraced the digital future, another mourned the loss of a craft built on touch, judgment, and the steady rhythm of hands at work. What once took a team a week could now be done by one person in an afternoon. The change was absolute, and for many it felt like the ground had vanished beneath their feet. Today, design happens in seconds, not hours. Mistakes are undone with a click. But the physical labor of the 1970s built a discipline that endures in every layout and logo. Craft may look different now, but its value is more vital than ever. What will we value next?